I got my copy of Star Fox 64 from a friend. His mom was a hairdresser, and one of her clients worked at a video store that was closing down at the time. This person had managed to pilfer a stack of Nintendo 64 games, which they gave to his mom for him to have. My friend already had a copy of Star Fox 64, and since this was before trading games was shoved down your throat like it is today, he just gave me his copy. Star Fox 64 is probably the game I've played more than any other on my Nintendo 64, and for good reason. It's one of my favorite games of all time. I play through it a few times a year, and it still never gets old. The thrill of whizzing through Corneria, gunning down ships, chasing Starwolf through Fortunia, taking down the train with the Landmaster on Macbeth, these are just a few of the huge moments Star Fox 64 has to offer. It's unfortunate then that we've never gotten a real sequel to Star Fox 64. Sure, there have been sequels, the oddball Zelda wannabe adventures, the entirely too ground-focused combat of Assault, and, of course, Command, which views strategy with the all-range mode from 64. But each one has deviated from what made the series so successful in the first place, in turn, giving us with titles that have shades of greatness, but never really living up to the height of the game I love so much. So when Nintendo teased a new Star Fox at E3 in 2014, I told myself not to get too excited until they revealed more, which they did at E3 2015. And finally, it seemed like we were gonna get the game I'd been waiting for nearly 2 decades for. But then the video changes. Oh. And that brings us to where we are today. Star Fox Zero is the closest game we've gotten to Star Fox 64 that isn't the 3D remake. Like the previous installments, Star Fox Zero has players flying through space on a mission to save the Lilas system as Fox McCloud. Alongside him is his trusty team, Falco, Peppy, and Slippy. Zero presents itself as a reimagining of Star Fox 64, adding more content to the original with plenty of new to go along with it. Zero is not a game you'll be playing to show off the Wii U's graphical capabilities. With titles like Super Smash Bros. And Mario Kart 8 having been out for a couple years already, it's safe to say the Wii U can do much better than what Star Fox Zero has to offer. None of it is particularly bad, but more than a few enemies are very basic in their design and structure. These spiders would have been impressive on the Super Nintendo maybe, but not so much here. There's also a few spots where the textures are pretty bad, but none that really stand out. But even the planets themselves aren't very memorable. Despite the game having you play through nearly every single one in some capacity, I found myself unsure if I recognized the stage I was on or not, just because they stood out so little during my second playthrough. A lot of the sound effects are taken right from Star Fox 64, largely from what I can assume to be nostalgia's sake. The original voice cast for most of the characters return, and the dialogue is wonderfully cheesy again. Banter between characters is fun, though there are certain dogfights and bosses where you'll hear the same lines repeated frequently. Subsequent playthroughs also reveal how few lines there are in said areas, but that's to be expected. Star Fox Zero's best trait is probably the music. Tracks from previous titles are remastered once again, like Starwolf's theme, and they sound tremendous. All of the music is regulated to the TV, however, with all of the dialogue coming from the gamepad. Sound effects are split between the two, depending on where they're coming from. This feature can be turned off, of course, but it really makes good use of the gamepad speakers. Alright, let's get down to brass tacks. The controls. Do they work? Go figure. That's not a simple question. Star Fox Zero is broken into two main parts: the on-rail phases that have been the entire backbone of the series since the Super Nintendo days, and the all-range mode fights, introduced officially in Star Fox 64. The on-rail phases are when the game is at its best, especially in the R-Wing. During my first playthrough, I was stubborn enough to play the game just like Star Fox 64, which you can do despite the game constantly reminding you not to. Slowly, I began to use the gamepad more frequently to hit targets while avoiding enemies. By far, this is where the gamepad control scheme feels like it works best. Never does the gyroscope control feel better than the 64 predecessor, but it does at least feel like it works. That's more than can be said for the all-range mode. At this point, Fox can fly anywhere in the level and take down enemies without any real restraint. There's several huge problems that occur in all-range mode. Some are consistent, some aren't. Number 1. No map. For some reason, there's no map at all in the all-range mode in Star Fox Zero, despite having 2 screens. Instead, you have what's called ZL targeting. Hitting ZL will snap the camera immediately to the target. Doing so means your R-Wing is still flying and suddenly harder to control because of this different perspective. ZL targeting is also an issue when there are multiple targets flying around that it wants you to take out, be it during dogfights with Star Wolf or just shooting down a number of enemies, which, segueing into number 2, is forced ZL targeting. Okay, so this doesn't exactly happen often, but when it does, it totally sucks. See, your wingmen are constantly reminding you that you can get a better view from the cockpit, which means looking down at the gamepad. But the R-Wing is vulnerable from all angles, so you'll have to peel your eyes away from the screen to look down and just to try to get some shots in. Now typically this isn't a big deal because ZL targeting is activated when you press said button, but sometimes the game feels the need to just lock it in for the entire fight. This means your R-Wing is suddenly difficult to control, your crosshairs are gone, and all of your aiming has to be done on the gamepad. This is Star Fox Zero at its absolute worst. I know it looks like I'm playing like garbage here, but trying to balance shooting on the gamepad with projectiles that are out of your point of view unless you're watching the TV is a complete nightmare. To keep the R-Wing safe and to take shots at enemies, you'll have to move your entire body just to do both. And I know that might sound lazy, but Star Fox 64 did this so well. It feels completely unnecessary to shove this mechanic in that, in the end, just isn't fun. Thankfully, these don't appear too often, but when they do, you'll just be wishing you were back to an on-rail segment and not trying to balance the two between one another. And finally, we have number 3, vehicle transformations. So, I actually don't mind the walker mode. Seriously, I don't. The controls are a little clunky and the gyroscope aiming makes it more difficult than it should be at times, but overall, I think it's fine. What I hate, however, are the times the game just up and decides that you need to play as it was intended. If Peppy barks at you to use the walker, you better, or else the game will simply change it for you. Doing so creates this disorienting mess that loses your momentum, which, by the way, no map, so if the boss is right up on you, you're sure to take a hit. Nearly every vehicle you use in all range mode presents itself as though there's multiple ways to take down a boss, but in reality, you either play by the game's rules or die trying. Now this all probably sounds pretty harsh, but it's only made worse by the fact that Star Fox Zero has some moments of complete, utter brilliance. Dogfights with Star Wolf are the highlight of the entire game once again, with Wolf and the gang being smarter than they've ever been before. The gyroscope control does help here, only if because your crosshairs are going to move so far if you don't use it. The taunts and ferocity of your rivals make for exhilarating fights, and they are, like the original, one of the parts I would go back to just to fight again and again. There's also the on-rail phases that I mentioned before, which are a ton of fun, even in the Landmaster. It's just that these phases are so short and kind of infrequent compared to the rest of the game, most of which takes place in the all-range mode. It doesn't help that some of the all-range fights use the Landmaster, which, while fun to use during the on-rail segments, is just a slog during all-range mode. Like I said before, Star Fox 64 is one of my favorite games of all time. Every year I play through it at least a few times, just to encounter Star Wolf and take down Andross and save the galaxy. I've been waiting nearly 2 decades for a proper sequel to it, and as of this review, I still don't have it. Star Fox Zero feels more like a reunion tour than a comeback. We're hearing and seeing a lot of what we love from the Nintendo 64, but without the same kind of feel to it. Zero is the kind of game that seems to bank entirely on nostalgia more than anything else. The problem is, everything is there. I'm not sure if Miyamoto felt that using the gamepad would bring something new to the table or reinvigorate the series, but all it manages to do is bog the experience down. And when you manage to come to grips with the controls, you realize something. It's not the Star Fox 64 2 we had hoped for. This isn't the game that makes me feel like a kid again. And maybe that's on me. Maybe my love for Star Fox 64 set the bar just a little too high, but in no way, shape, or form can I recommend buying Star Fox Zero. Star Fox Zero may very well be the best Star Fox game we've gotten since Star Fox 64, but it's the kind of game you rent or bum off a friend just to experience it once and then move on. The controls aren't nearly as bad as some claim, but with an entire game built around a gimmick that didn't need to exist in the first place, the whole package just winds up getting overshadowed by the original. Find a card of Star Fox 64, play that instead, and we'll all keep waiting to get that real sequel.